Harry Kresky is going to speak first, and then Kim. So just briefly, I think I've known Harry half of my life and Kim somewhere between a quarter and a third of my life. So they're obviously very, very old friends. Harry's an activist attorney in electoral and political reform. He was appointed by Mayor Michael Bloomberg to serve on the 2002 New York City Charter Revision Commission. He has served as counsel to the New York State Independence Party and currently represents the party's New York City organizations. He is also currently representing 11 voters in federal litigation defending Idaho's open primary system. Those are all very big issues. He happens to be the Eastside Institute's legal counsel, which we're very, very fortunate and grateful for, and has a private law practice in New York City. Harry's a graduate of the Columbia Law School of 1971, where he served as an editor of the Columbia Law Review. Please welcome Harry Kresky.
Well, I'm not from India or Canada, although I was born in South Dakota, and I grew up on Long Island, as did Lois, for that matter. It would be helpful to try and talk some about what it's like for someone who, either congenitally or at a very early age, found out that they're rebellious and anti-authoritarian, what it's like to work in the courts and how one navigates that. Court, at least as I experience it, is something like junior high school homeroom, where you can't talk out of turn or go to the bathroom without raising your hand and all of those kinds of awful things about authoritarian and bureaucratic institutions. I was very radicalized by the 60s. I was at Columbia in 1968 when all those things happened. I was very active in the anti-war movement, and I really wanted to be a radical journalist, but my parents were doctors and I grew up on Long Island. I thought, well, why not go to law school? You'll have a trade that you can always fall back on no matter what happens. And so I did that. I got to law school and I found out that I was very good at it. I did very well in law school. I got very high grades. And I continued to be a troublemaker and a radical. And at one point, the law review is the sort of the top students in the class become part of publishing this journal, and the librarian at the law school told me that if you're on the law review, your future is assured. So little did he know where this member of the law review was headed. But in any event, one of the things that I did in law school, this was a cultural experience, as Lois said we should talk about cultural experiences, was there's this thing called clerkships where graduating students can go to work for a judge for a year or two, and get an inside look at the court system, and they're prestigious and sometimes interesting. And the law schools, different schools have connections with different judges. So at Columbia, they took all the students who were on the law review and had a private meeting with them and said, Columbia is connected to this judge and to that judge, and we think you might fit in well there, and blah, blah, blah. Then about 2 weeks later, they had a meeting of the whole school, all the seniors, and talked about the official process for getting a clerkship. So I stood up at the meeting and said, most of you don't know this, but in fact the members of the law review, this was in the 60s, so the members it was 1971 actually, but but the members of the law review 2 weeks earlier had this private meeting, with the powers that be, and we're told how it really works. So that caused something of a furor. I had a meeting with the dean. They assured us that reforms would be initiated. And of course, nothing changed, but that's the nature of these things, of bureaucratic and modernist institutions. And then I graduated, worked down.
Wait, so did you get a clerkship?
No, I wasn't even interested. Actually, I didn't think I would get one after that. Anyway.
What did the dean say?
He said, we know this is a problem, we're going to do something about it, and this and that. And that was the last time we spoke, actually. But I worked for a law firm for a short period of time and went off on my own. And then in 1974, I met our development community and kind of have had a very growthful and interesting experience of learning or developing ways of representing developmentalists, representing people working for social change, doing radical things or advancing radical ways of looking at things and causes in the context of what's one of the most bureaucratic, modernist, and maybe feudal and outcome-oriented system where it's all about results. I could just talk for just a minute and then I'll stop, of sort of the relationship between what we're trying to accomplish there in this work and then the cultural experience of doing that, which isn't that different than experience with the clerkships, although I'm somewhat more subtle and hopefully better at it than I was then. So there's two, as I see it at least, there's two sides of what we're trying to do in court. One, in a strategic sense, we're trying to challenge the two-party paradigm, which is a part of which is the legal matrix in which electoral politics and government take place. And the laws are written by and for the two parties. They heavily favor the two parties. The courts play an important and integral role in maintaining the two-party system and so on and so forth. And then the other part of the work, which obviously they're related, is to use the court system or to sometimes defensively, sometimes offensively, but to use my skills and experience as an attorney to support the building of a grassroots, democratic, independent movement. And that's an interesting experience because on the one hand we know some things about how the two-party system works and how the electoral process works that you don't really know in the way that we know it if you're kind of sitting somewhere else, or if you're on the other side, if you're so much a part of it that you can't see it or experience it in that way. And also often what we do and say, is really challenging that system and the court, which is a guardian of and very much a part of that system. And being able to work there has really involved one just simply trying to find a way to be there without going off, getting thrown out, so antagonizing the judge that you have no hope of impacting at all. And then also trying to find the cracks or the crevices in the framework in which you can do something or you can move something. And so, for example, this was some time ago, after the 1992 Fulani campaign, where she and we raised a lot of money in matching funds, like well over $1 million, which is really the first time that an independent candidate, did anything like that. This is federal primary matching funds, and because of partly some political fighting and partly Because we did that, the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, went after us with a vengeance and essentially claimed that we weren't running a real campaign, that the whole thing was a scam to take federal money and divert it to other uses and this and that, which wasn't true. And even if it was true, it's not illegal as long as you did the things that the law said you had to do in order to get the money. And it's not as if the 250 other candidates that qualify, or however many other candidates that qualified for these things, weren't advancing their own personal agendas as well. So in some ways it didn't mean very much. But one of the things that we did was we decided that what would be most useful and put the FEC on the spot would be to do something very radical and very open. And we said the reason why this looks odd to you is that the people that are conducting this campaign, or the core people that conducted the campaign, are part of a socialist collective. And therefore, how we do things might not look the same as how the Clinton campaign or this campaign or that campaign does things. But in fact, the Constitution of the United States, allows people to do things and give expression to their political views and point of view and so on. And it worked. The FEC actually backed off and went from assessing, so long ago I forgot the numbers now, it went from assessing, like asking us to pay back 90% of the money that we got to asking us to pay back about 4 or 5%. And even the justification for the 4 or 5% was simply face saving, because they had to do something, even though that 5% didn't make any more sense than the other 90% that they were trying to get us to pay back. But I think we were able to recognize something about this structure and some investment that the government had in maintaining some semblance of fairness, and to engage that in a very straightforward and very open way, which I think really put them on the defensive. More recently, how are we doing time-wise? Should I stop soon? Okay. More recently, as Lois mentioned, we're involved in this case in Idaho. So first of all, for even a New York Jew who was born in South Dakota, Idaho is a cultural experience in and of itself, although actually it's fine. And the court system, courtrooms in some ways, no matter where they are pretty much the same. The rooms are designed, the federal courthouses, they're designed by the same federal bureaucracy. It designs the courtrooms in Idaho as in New York. And people sit in the same place and so on and so forth. One of the things that we did in Idaho as part of the case is by in the Idaho case, the Republican Party, and this is happening in several states, has brought a lawsuit. Idaho is one of 20 states that has open primaries and nonpartisan registration, which for people from New York, we don't even understand what that means, but because the gateway to voting in New York is you have to, when you fill out your voter registration form, you check a box as to which party you want to be a member of, or you have to check a box that says, I don't want to be in a party. And then you probably get put on some list somewhere. But in any event, Idaho for years now, 40 or 50 years, has not had partisan registration, and everybody votes in the primary because there are no Democrats and Republicans, even though they're party primaries, to select the Republican or the Democratic nominee. And the Republican Party, and this is part of a national campaign by them, went to court in Idaho to try and get a federal court to order the state of Idaho to institute partisan registration and close its primaries on the grounds that it violates, this is a weird argument, it violates the right of Republicans to freely associate by having the possibility of a Democrat or an independent vote in their primary. They say they have to tailor their message more than they would, or differently than they would if only Republicans were voting, and so on and so forth. It's a very radical argument because of the fact that the party is asserting the right to tell the state and the people of Idaho how to conduct the elections which elect their public officials. And so one of the things that we did is we took the deposition of the chairperson of the Idaho Republican Party. And the Attorney General, we intervened in the case, and we're defendants because the Republicans brought the suit along with the Attorney General of the state of Idaho, who's a good lawyer and kind of a nice guy. But he was like very, very careful in his deposition of the chairperson of the Idaho Republican Party. He's very deferential. He asked some good questions, and he had a strategy. But I just went after the guy. You know, I said, well, isn't this case really about, isn't this case has little to do with your First Amendment rights because no one's preventing you from having a party, from saying what you want. There are other ways in which you could ensure the purity of who votes in your primary. For example, in the state of Virginia, the Republican Party is allowed to challenge a voter who voted in another primary in the past and make them sign a pledge. That's pretty outlandish, but it's not quite as outlandish as or as radical as, you know, so there are other ways of accomplishing your objective. And it isn't what the case is really about, is whether or not the state of Idaho can tell whether or not the Republican Party can tell the state of Idaho how to conduct its elections. You know, and there are other questions sort of along those lines. One of the 11 Idaho voter who invited us to get involved in the case, he's one of the plaintiffs, he was like very uptight after the deposition because I don't think he had ever seen someone take on an established figure like that, and you know, that aggressively or that directly or whatever. He didn't say that, but that was kind of just, you know, what it seemed like in any event. So that's like one side of. And then when we argued the case in February, the Republicans got themselves a better lawyer who actually did a very good job. And there was this issue that kept coming up during the back and forth with the judge that we hadn't anticipated, and which the new lawyer reformulated that made their case stronger. He said, well, look, he said, since Idaho doesn't have partisan registration, and since they didn't do any empirical study, they weren't able to empirically, this was the Attorney General's point, they couldn't empirically establish that any candidate had changed his or her message, or the outcome of any primary would have been different, and the state was resting its case on the issue of, well, there's no harm here, and therefore how can you say your rights have been violated? And then what the Republicans did is they said the mere possibility of a Democrat or an independent voting in our primary, and obviously there's some possibility, or it's a sure thing that there'll be some of them, forces our candidates to change their message, and therefore has a chilling effect on you know, our message, and therefore that violates our right to freedom of association. And it wasn't until the end of the argument, after the plaintiff spoke, the Attorney General spoke, I spoke, then the plaintiffs get rebuttal, that I kind of realized that the judge was buying into this and that we had to find a way of responding to this, and I thought I had a way of responding to it. But the argument was over, and the judge said, okay, I'm reserving decision, and I stood up and kind of raised my hand and said, Your Honor, can I say something else? And he said, well, okay, but make it fast. And then I said, really this has nothing to do with the First Amendment. What we're really talking about is the Republicans want to have a system in place that creates a political calculus that they feel more comfortable with in crafting their message. And furthermore, Idaho has same-day voter registration, so really there's no predictability anyway, even under a partisan registration system, of who's going to vote in the primary. And the difference between just going and taking a Republican ballot as the system is now and the predictability of who's going to go and register Republican that day, while there's some difference, the effect on the calculus is minimal in any event. And number two, the state of Idaho has no obligation to allow the Republicans the political calculus that they want. And the judge said, oh, he said, that's interesting. And then asked the Republican lawyer what he thought about it. But the cultural experience in the court of standing up, and this seems absurd in a way, and asking if you can say something after the argument was over, particularly in Idaho, you know, was very intimidating, you know, and not an easy thing to do. And then just the last piece of, because of the fact that we've been more successful, and I guess I'm somewhat more well known. I never joined a bar association committee. I mean, it was like out of the question. But I was invited by the chair of the electoral election committee of the major bar association in New York to join the committee. So I thought, well, I should be. And he said he invited me because he thought there should be independents represented there, so I thought I should say yes, obviously. And they're all election lawyers, or lawyers that are interested in election law. And they're all party people. And they talk about everything from that vantage point. And they're nice, but they're very conservative. Not just, some of them are more left-wing and some of them are right-wing, but the cultural experiences, they're just very in the box. And the experience of being there is, it's hard in a way, because you want to talk, because what's the point of being there? On the other hand, you don't want to talk in a way that people won't listen to you, even though they don't agree with anything that we're saying. So that's a new experience, beginning to navigate, those kinds of arenas. And sometimes it goes well, and sometimes I leave and I said, oh, you really should have just stopped talking, or you shouldn't have said anything, because nobody was listening, and just make it harder for them to hear you the next time. But you don't really know whether that's even true or not. So I talk to people about it. Kathy Stewart, who I live with, functions as my guide in these matters, but it's not so easy to get to the bottom of that. So in any event, it's just sharing some of the experiences on this journey of representing radical Americans in conservative institutions.
Thank you. Great, thank you. Okay, Kim Sabo Flores. She's an organizational development consultant, developmental psychologist officially a environmental psychologist by training, but I have a hard time thinking of her that way. So I think of her as a developmental psychologist. She has developed innovative methods of involving all the stakeholders of nonprofits or foundations or whatever kind of organization in participatory evaluation, research, and staff development. She will tell you she's a leader in this emerging field of youth participatory evaluation, and will likely in her remarks share some of what that is. And has worked for many dozens of nonprofits here in the United States and for several international humanitarian organizations, including UNICEF, Save the Children, and Child Watch. She is the author of a book that was published last year, Youth Participatory Evaluation, Strategies for Engaging Young People. And there she has brought a perspective, both a methodology and a theoretical perspective of play and performance in a developmental Vygotskian manner to that work. And she received her PhD from the Graduate Center in Environmental Psych in, I don't know the year.
99.
99?
I think so.
99. And was sort of pushed into that role of a graduate student by moi, who helped her receive her bachelor's degree from Empire State College prior to that. So it's a pleasure, Kim.
I've been thinking about this for a while, but while you were introducing me and all of those words were kind of flying around, that I don't know, after she said any of that, if you had any sense of what I do. I felt like I didn't. And Lois asking me to talk a little bit about what it is I do and how it is I bring this community's work and the development perspective into what I do. I realize that I'm still grappling a lot with talking about this in this work, because it's kind of a new field and a new lens for a field. And I was thinking all these things, like I'm an environmental psychologist, I'm a developmental psychologist, I'm a Vygotskian, I'm a child's rights advocate, I'm an organizational development specialist. Like all of these weird things kind of sit together and are located in me in a particular way. And I think the only way to talk about the work is to talk a little bit about my history, because it's kind of, the work is located in some of my own history. And in my history of knowing Lois for the last more than half of my life now, so and her influence on me and this community's influence on me and my academic journey and my journey into this new and strange field that I guess we keep developing in some sense. But so when I met Lois 20 years ago or something like that, she immediately organized me into a developmental psychologist and a Vygotskian who saw human development in a particular way. And I worked in, I'm going to try to remember the name of this program. I worked at the Barbara Taylor School, like a lot of some folks that are sitting in this room, a Vygotskian laboratory school. I worked at Pregnant Productions. I don't know if any of you remember Pregnant Productions, a street theater program in Harlem. We did great work there. And then, is it Growing Up Performed? Yes, I got it right. I can never remember the name of that program, which was a program for young people who were, half the group work in a homeless shelter, or were living in a homeless shelter, and the other half were in a parochial school in Little Italy. It was the strangest combination of young people ever. It was like the most challenging program, who were potentially sexually abused. But anyway, so it was a really challenging program. I think it's why I can't remember the name of it ever, because it really challenged me. So I was working very practically in the field, working on how to develop programs for and with young people that were developmental and that were growthful, using performance. And Lois at some point convinced me to go to graduate school, which I wasn't convinced about, but with a lot of support on Lois's half. I mean, a lot of me calling her in the middle of the night saying, what am I doing here? Why am I here? I kind of engaged that process in that institution. It was very difficult for me. And I met the professor that I was working with most closely there was Dr. Roger Hart. And I was working with Roger in the Center for Human Environments there. And one of the things that we were working on, and that center was working on, was very early on in the early stages of this treaty on children's rights. And it was the time that they were writing the treaty and things were just becoming, states were just signing on to ratify the treaty. And the particular articles in the treaty that were of interest to me and to Roger and the center at that time were the articles that had to do with youth participation, child and youth participation. And that treaty is, these particular articles within the treaty say that it's a right of every child to participate in all decision making that impacts their life. So that means that it's their right to participate in how their schools are designed, how their psychological support is given to them, how their families are run, right? It's a pretty radical treaty. Every country in the world has signed and ratified this treaty, except for the United States and Somalia, but Somalia's collapsed, so they kind of have an excuse. We have no excuse. So anyway, but that was more than a decade ago, and at that time, in that center still, and we collectively still continue to try to engage with how to make sure that that treaty actually happens on the ground, right? So at that time, the Children's Environments Research Group was really experimenting with what would this possibly look like if it could happen, and what could be some things that we could do to advance that work on the ground. And at that time, there was just some experimentation on engaging children and youth in research. So there's all this participatory action research happening, and some experimentation around young people planning programs and doing action research in their community. And somebody, I don't know who brought this up, said, well, where all this money is being spent on young people, all these programs are popping up all over the place, and where are the young people in the evaluation of the programs, right? What's happening around that? And somehow I got nominated to go find out what that would be like. Kind of as one of the team members, like what should we do around young people's engagement in evaluating these programs that are meant to serve them. And I have to tell you, I wasn't jumping up and down with enthusiasm because I had been a program person. I had been the person evaluated before, and I kind of got what that looked like. So the whole field of evaluation wasn't something that I was, so excited to go find out more about. But I really thought that it was important that if we were going to talk about how this treaty would roll out, and if we were going to talk about youth development and child development, that this issue be looked at. And so that became the topic of my dissertation, and certainly the topic of a lot of work that I've been doing. But as I started to learn more about the field of evaluation, I realized that I was kind of coming to them in a moment of their own crisis, their own kind of postmodern meltdown. And one thing I will have to say about evaluation that I like is that they have, at least in some ways, grappled with and been grappling with what's the use of all this information? Like, what are we doing? What is all of this data being produced for? Who's using it? What's happening with it? And so I kind of entered into the field of evaluation to find out more about how young people could be involved in it, just as the field itself was saying, what the hell are we doing? And which was kind of a nice time to be introduced to it, because I meant that I could participate in that discussion a little bit. And so there was this whole conversation about usefulness. We were producing all this data, all of these studies about these programs and whether or not they're working. The programs themselves aren't using it. Everybody's being told that how money is being allocated has something to do with how they're being evaluated, but in fact that's not true. Still not true, by the way. It has nothing to do with it. Mostly because the people who are making decisions about where the money goes don't know enough about evaluation to use the findings to make a decision, which is still very much the case. And so there were lots of people talking about, well, if we're going to make it useful, what we need to do is engage people in the process of determining what it is that we're going to evaluate, how it is that we're going to evaluate, and how we're going to know if the program's there, down the road. And so there became this whole, in the beginning, very small fraction of evaluation was talking about participatory approaches, how to engage the staff and stakeholders of a program in the process of deciding what they should evaluate. At that time, it was a really small topical interest group in the Evaluation Association. And so I met with somebody who was doing a study of all the evaluators in the country who were using a participatory approach. And I asked how many were doing it in educational settings with young people or nonprofits. And he said quite a lot. And I said, good, can you pull out the list of people who, when they've engaged young people and what that's looked like? And they said, nobody's engaging young people in that process. It's the staff and political stakeholders and funders, but it's not young people. So I kind of knew I was on to something here, and kept, again, trying to find places where I could make inroads into how young people could be engaged in this process. And still, I think that people are talking about participation, even client participation, which is what they call young people in these settings, as being about the usefulness of the data in some ways. And some people even talk about it as that having the young people or the clients involved improve the data, like improve the empiricism in a way. And then there's another body of people, and I'm in that camp, who are saying the actual activity of engaging in a collective performance, if you will, of what are we doing here together? What is this program about? Where are we headed? What do we want to know about what we're doing? Is a developmental process, right? And that it's transformative, not only of the individuals who are participating in that, but of the programs and sometimes even of the communities. So over the last decade or more, I guess I've been raising this question of how the field of evaluation can create environments that, through evaluation, that are developmental for the people who are working in those environments, for the people and for the organizations themselves. And so I kind of keep being a nudge in some ways to that community around what are we doing with development in relationship to evaluation. And so I've done that through some articles and books and through constant presentations at the American Evaluation Association. And I've also done that in the very practice that I do when I'm working with foundations and with nonprofits. And I think I've been successful with about a dozen or more foundations in convincing them that perhaps one way to think about evaluation is as a way to help themselves and grantees grow their work rather than it being about a decision making about whether or not they should get money. And a couple of foundations have gotten very much invested in this strategy of grant making for them that is much more a partnership approach with the grantee and much more an approach where if the nonprofit succeeds, the foundation succeeds. So that we should all be thinking about how to make sure that the organizations that they're giving money to and the foundation are growing in terms of their thinking and their response to the social issues that are happening. And not, of course, there's the evaluators that are still very much in the camp of we need to know from an from an empirical perspective whether or not this works or not, and we need to know with hard science. But there's many more people interested in than you would think, actually, how can we partner and make sure these organizations are doing something positive in the community. And often evaluation is one of those moments for both nonprofits and foundations where it's the first time they've actually talked about what it is that they're doing. I mean, there's a mission statement, everybody has one, right? But there's not it's not an ongoing dialogue. Like, where are we now? What are we doing? What do we hope to change? And evaluation, I think, is a moment where people have to start to have that dialogue again, or else I can't possibly come in and talk about how to look at that if we can't all agree on what it is. So I think often when I do evaluation work, we're months into it before we ever talk about a scientific method. We're months into talking about what are we doing together before there's ever a data collection strategy designed. And then I just will talk really about one specific project that Lois asked me to talk about, which is definitely one of those challenging environments, because I think mostly what I've done is cream the crop. I mean, I mostly work with clients who kind of buy into what I'm saying right away, and they go, that's fantastic, come and change our organization, help us grow, so exciting, right? And I kind of have been lucky enough, there's enough of those people that I can say no when I realize that people don't want to do that with me. But UNICEF is one exception to my rule. So I recently took a project, and I have often taken projects with the UN, who I know that I probably can't move organizationally. They're kind of pretty stuck with how they're organized, much in the same way that the legal system is. And while there are strong advocates for participation, at headquarters there's absolutely nothing looking like participation happening there. So it's pretty hard to get them organized around even having conversations in the same room together, because there's a lot of different levels who don't meet in the same room together. There's a level 2 who will never meet with a level 5. I mean, it's, so that's certainly challenging to open up dialogue. But I took this particular project with the Adolescent Development and Participation Unit at UNICEF because of the work around child rights, and because there's been so much experimentation in the last decade and a half since the convention was signed around child and adolescent participation in the world. There's been youth parliaments set up all over the world. I worked a lot in the Dominican Republic. In every municipality in the Dominican Republic, there's a parallel government of young people. And you should see the elections are remarkable. The kids will organize 10,000 kids to come out and vote. per little municipality, right? And it doesn't matter in the young people's elections whether or not you are legal or not, which is great, you know, because you can vote even if you're not legal. You can vote if you're not in school, and so there's a lot of assurances around that. But there's been a huge amount of experimentation happening internationally. And so I took the project because I really wanted to be in touch with and close to what's happening with that and how is that rolling out and what are people thinking about in terms of participation and not thinking about. I mean, I think in particular, I mean, the child parliaments are fascinating to me. I think they're indicative a little bit of what's happening is that the notion of participation, because it's a right, is stuck in some ways, and I don't know how to describe this. It's a right, right? So therefore, if there's an adult government, there's a child government, right? But it's not connected to development, right? It's a fundamental right, so they have the right to be there, and so they're there. And it's not clear to me that anybody, or even the institutions, are developing. So, for example, in these child parliaments, what that looks like is, you know, you'll go into any municipal building and there's this adult wing, and then there's kind of some offices where young people are. And there are some ways to interact, but they're kind of wacky, and none of the adults have had any conversation even about what does it mean that we have all these young people working here, right? And how are we going to do this together, and how could that possibly change the environment in which we're working in? It's kind of almost like they're just, I mean, that's what I mean by it being their right. It's just their right, they're here, but nobody's kind of dealing with them. So I'm interested in, with them to continually, I've been doing a lot of pushing on this, them kind of beginning to understand the relationship between the right to participate and young people's development, and how those things might come together. And what I'm looking for is to learn a lot more about what's happening internationally, and also to see where we, as this community and collective, could impact the understanding of adolescent rights to participate and adolescent development, and perhaps ways that we could be communicating around how to bring those things together more closely in practice on the ground.
Thank you. So listening to both, this is, it's one of those things that's obvious, but I didn't ever think about it before. Well, it's sort of you know that the legal institution permeates all of our lives and many, many other institutions, but I hadn't thought about the connection between, in some sense, law is all about evaluation through evidence, and evaluation is obviously similarly it's evaluative through evidence. I mean, that's what the evaluation is. The material of the evaluation is evidence, and in both of them, just in both of these. Even though Kim's field is called evaluation, it's not. It's called assessment. It's called, how to get money. How does your school stay open or not? Do teachers get raises? I mean, it's so huge. Anyway, that's one thing I wanted you to both comment on. And the second is I don't know if I know what a right is legally. And Harry, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, the rights of the child, and as something that we don't even know about it in the U.S. I'm sure you stop a kid on the street and he has no idea that he or she has rights, according to the United Nations. So, sorry if I put the two questions together, but.
Well, one of Well, the rights question is really fascinating. The legal system is supposedly organized around rights. On the other hand, it's hard to say what a right is if some alien person is evaluating whether or not you have one. So, but one of the brightest and certainly most famous Supreme Court justices, Oliver Wendell Holmes, said he didn't believe in rights. He thought that what was happening in different cases was this is a very elitist point of view, but it's helpful, is that his view of what the court was doing was not evaluating or weighing different rights or saying whether you had a right or didn't have a right, but what the court was doing was deciding whether or not the overall interest of the society was advanced by according the plaintiff or the claimant the relief that they were seeking. So he had a very non-rights view of the legal system, and probably a more evaluative sense, or even more modernist scientific sense of what they were doing. So I think I find that helpful, because the rights, I don't know, the rights thing is hard because you have two sides and each side claims it has a right. So how do you resolve that? I was thinking of this quote off of some work we were doing in Fred's developmental philosophy group, that at the end of the Civil War, at his second inaugural, Abraham Lincoln commented on how strange it was to have a God to which both sides of this conflict about whether slavery should be allowed to continue were appealing, and each side was absolutely sure that God was on their side. So the whole rights issue, I think is a troubling one, actually. And I think in some ways what you're saying is an instantiation of that. So what does it mean to have a right to sit in a building, when, you're ignored?
Right.
Anyway.
Right.
So,
There's no budget.
right. Yeah.
I think it's interesting because I feel like, Harry knows more. I don't know anything about law or rights, but I know that, I know that there's these international treaties, right? The we haven't signed a women's rights one either. We don't sign treaties. We draft them, actually. We're very involved in the drafting of them, and we don't sign them. But
Because of the sovereign rights of America.
right, exactly.
Not be subject to any treaty.
Exactly. So, and in the international community, people take them pretty seriously. Like there's policy after policy drafted about these things, and implementation strategies put into play, and programming built around them, and in a way that we don't have here. Like we don't. I don't know enough to know how the things are being driven, but I see it there. That there's, if you look at these country level policies, there's hundreds of them drafted off of each treaty. So something's happening. I'm not sure. What's challenging to me is whether or not those have anything to do with what happens in everyday life for a young person. I'm not sure yet, and one of the things I guess I'm being tasked to do is seeing if it does, which will be a fascinating question. Right now, for example, I've been just doing a survey of 178 countries, policies, strategies, guidances, all of this stuff they call knowledge about adolescent rights and development, and then seeing if there's any relationship to that, all of that stuff, and the programs on the ground. And so far, nothing. I can't see any relationship at all. So I actually was raising this question with the UN the other day, which was, how are you going to feel if I find out that all the work that you're doing, the work that they're doing is called enabling environment work, this kind of all of this policy level work has anything to do with what's happening on the ground. And sometimes I see a lot of great stuff happening on the ground, there's no enabling environment. So what's that about, right? And so that's one of the questions that I'm being tasked to ask, to answer and to address in this study. So I have no idea. Right now it doesn't look positive that the policy level work leads to community level change. But I can say something though. I kind of wasn't a child rights person from the get-go, even though I was working in the center and we were doing that work. I kind of thought it would never lead to community level change. And then I did this study for the Dominican Republic of their rollout of what they call child-friendly cities, which is one kind of one way that the child's rights has been kind of put into play. And I can walk up to any child, any street kid, and say to him, "Do you know what your rights are?" And they will say even they're not in school, they will say blah 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 blah. I say, "Where do you go when you're in trouble?" They tell me, they walk me to the ombudsperson, and so there is something happening because of it. There is something on the ground happening. I mean, here you couldn't talk to no kid even knows what you're talking about when you say, "Do you know what your rights are?" So something is happening because of it, and I think we're still early enough on to not know what that will mean.
Can you say what an enabling environment is?
That's my enabling environment. It's that there is a substantial amount of laws, policies, studies. They do a remarkable amount of situation analysis, like what are the situations young people are in, networks. I mean, so there are all these kind of meta.
And if you have a certain number of them at the right places, you have.
Yeah, they don't really know they don't know what that magic figure is, but they feel like that if there's a substantial amount of that work happening at the regional and country level office, kind of, that something will change in the community, specifically around adult youth relationships, right? And so.
The last thing you were saying when you said something is happening, and that if you walk up to a kid in the Dominican Republic and he or she can say, "Yeah, I have the right to be in school." I don't know. It sounds like nothing.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that has to do with. Because when I first heard about this, and I actually have heard I was in some kind of seminar that Roger Hart, who Kim mentioned as the person who brought her into this work, organized with people from a few different countries. And it somewhat, the tone of it is that the U.S. is really, low. How could we not sign it? And no kids here know their rights, but kids all over the world know their rights. And mothers are, with the breast milk that they're giving to their babies in El Salvador, they're teaching them they have rights and how, kind of romanticizing it. And you look around the world and kids here happen to have a better life than in most of the countries. So I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
And teaching people that they have rights doesn't
necessarily give them rights
at all. It doesn't power. So, but I'm also not putting it down. I'm just saying that I never quite understood the overflating of teaching people, young people, mothers, and so on, their rights. That's all.
One thing I was thinking about rights from the vantage point of civil rights and voting rights.
Yeah.
So obviously, it makes a difference to an African American or a woman, whether or not, or a non-property holder. Those are some of the categories that were accorded the right to vote or fought and won the right to vote. So obviously, that's very important. And but I don't know what the use of the word right adds to that. I mean, what that confers. I mean, the society should have allowed everybody to vote from the beginning, and it took the abolitionist movement and the suffrage movement, to change that and to expand the franchise. So in some ways, the right is really the product of a civil war or a power struggle or politics.
Right.
But to the individuals who are asserting that right or claiming that right, it's very, very important. So it's a funny kind of a thing, the right, in that sense.
Well, it makes me think about enabling environment. I was thinking about the flip side of the enabling environment. To what extent is the civil rights movement, those are the enabling environment?
Right.
Like the way you were describing it, defines enabling environment as
Right.
coming from the top
Yeah.
down.
Yeah.
It ignores the fact that all the rights we had,
Came from the
as
bottom.
far as I can
That's
tell,
right.
even, like I think about the Declaration of the inalienable rights, if you believe they existed from God, the fact was it took a movement of people
Right. to-
standing up and saying, these are our rights, to make them
Yeah.
anything. So there is a way it gets turned around as if the rights come from
From the
here.
top, yeah.
Um,
I've been thinking that this is an interesting kind of, well, I have lots of things to say about. One is that, and what does it mean to have a right to participate in a quote, and I think what they mean is a democratic process in some way when they talk about it in a country that has no democracy. I mean, it's kind, it's kind of wild to even think about. And then I've been thinking a lot about what is happening in the U.S. around, youth-led social change movements and that kind of work. One thing I guess I've often thought that would be helpful here is that I work in like hundreds of youth-led social change organizations around this country. And, they all have issues, like, they all have their own issue area, lesbian, gay, transgendered groups, disabled groups, they all have a particular kind of issue that they're going in with, right? And one of the things that's challenging is that they're not at the table. Like, they have to fight both to be at the table because they're young people and to bring up their issue at a table, but they have to fight first to get to the table. So in some ways, it's interesting because we have a fairly strong movement of young people here who don't even have the right to be at the table.
Right.
So in some ways, we're coming from the bottom up, and we're seeing the rest of the kind of world move from the top down, and it's interesting to see
One
what
of the
young people want.
things about rights, which I'm thinking as you're talking, is how caught up, I don't even know if this is necessary or the only way it could be, but rights seem very caught up with identity politics.
Yeah.
So in some funny way, rights divide people rather than
Yeah.
bring people together. Even though, in theory, according everyone the same rights would create some form of equality and cooperation, but it doesn't seem to work that way in some funny way. So that's one of the contradictions of a right-based policy.
Mary.
Well, this is helpful because I think now I realize I'm a Holmesian when it comes to rights things, since now I know that I'll window. Because I've done a fair amount of work recently in the international arena where rights is big. And it's interesting because I was thinking about what you were saying, Harry, about what does adding rights to it add? Because it seems to me it's interesting because it seems the relevant point is that the young people aren't at the table.
Yeah.
Not that they don't have a right to be at the table, that they aren't at the table. So I think it's interesting to kind of deepen the answer of why, and I've kind of come to the point of thinking, I think rights add an unnecessary top-down mediated barrier. And I think are fairly detrimental to development and growth. I really do. I think they aren't the avenue, and I think they're designed to actually pretty much prevent any kind of genuine grassroots, kind of to Carrie's point, because it's not clear to me why you wouldn't simply be concerned of, well, you're not at the table, you're not part of, what do we have to do? Regardless of whether you have the right to do it or not, you're not at the table, and if that's what some significant number of people believe is important, then, because I guess I think if this community had been so consumed with that, we wouldn't do anything. But you wouldn't be having the conversations in court that you know what I mean? Like we simply wouldn't be doing anything that we were doing because it's not clear to me there's a right to do it. I don't know that I think we have.
You just do it. You don't ask whether you can do it.
I don't know that if push came to shove, that the powers would be to say, yes, you have the right to do that. I don't. But what difference does it make if, in fact, what you're doing is, if your concern is helping people to develop?
And the source of rights, I think, historically, is in the concept of self, an individual, which is, I think that's the period in history when rights, someone living in serfdom, rights had nothing to do with anything. This is how you lived, and this is what you did, and it was as individual identity developed that people began to assert, and that was a positive development, but I don't know where we are now.
Yes, Anne, and then has been
I
just.
don't know the history of it, but I was thinking that it seems like rights have something to do with, I don't know, the development of democracy. Because, I mean, so if you're involved in a political struggle, but it's like, like the labor unions, and feel like that by the government recognizing your right to organize, and form a union, that you can, in order for be defended rather than be thrown in jail or be fired or, so there's some, it seems like there's some correlation between rights and the democratic process.
I think they grew up together, at least the
Yeah.
democracy and the Enlightenment and rights kind of Declaration of Independence
Right.
kind of happened together. So yeah, they are associated.
And at the same time, that if you're fighting for rights, like sort of like Mary was saying, it's acknowledging that there's, that people are being denied, or that people are being related to people they, that's different from other people.
But democracy is very tricky because democracy is also a majority rule, and the assertion of rights is often made on behalf of minorities. So it's a complicated relationship.
Well, what about like, I'm thinking like countries like Afghanistan, where women don't have certain, women are related to people they don't have the same rights as men.
Well, I guess what Mary would say is, what does rights add to the fact
What
that,
is- yeah.
that if
Yeah.
it's to how people live.
Also, one of the things I was thinking about, there's a couple things. One is there is this debate in communities, and we had it in the Reform Party and the Patriot Party, of, and currently, I think in black politics also, of whether you're going to go, at this point, given where we are now, in 2009, whether you're going to go to the organization or to the government and demand your rights, demand equality, demand, certain rights, or whether, as individuals, as groupings of people, as minority groupings, or whether you can do something on the ground with other people who are very different to figure out how to change the whole power dynamic so that there's more inclusion for everybody, and whether you can lead that. So that's, I think, a political debate, which in the independent movement, we, in a way, independents haven't had rights, for instance, to participate, like in New York, in the primary, but we did something with creating a party and having it as a representative of a movement that would fight for independent voters and the rights of independent voters, and also be able to impact on the whole structure, the whole political process, transforming the whole political process. So it seems like it's somewhat of a debate between whether you can sort of get things from the establishment or whether you're going to, from the bottom up, try to change the whole thing, the whole totalities, right?
Why is it, I'm just wondering why it's a debate and not that it's kind of both inside, outside, you do both. But you're saying it is a debate?
Well, with minor parties, who don't want to, they want to have their particular right to be on the ballot, whereas in nonpartisan elections, we're opening the whole process up. I think it is, it's both. We're doing both, but I think there is a debate, and this has come out.
Or Obama's, or the issues being raised in the civil rights movement.
It's kind of the antithesis of being supportive of grassroots mobilizing and grassroots organizing. And so there's almost this way that because the government's, well, even raising it with the UN, which I do kind of constantly all the time about like, well, how can we connect all these youth groups so that they can mobilize, so that they can actually enforce their rights, you know? And that question gets sidelined almost every time I bring it up, right? So there's a way that these disconnected kind of top-down things that are coming from the top down never get to the community, so they actually stop the mobilizing.
Right.
They stop this dialogue from actually coming to fore.
And also, what kind of, I mean, when I was a kid, the last thing you would do if you were, not that I was hip, but at least I was rebellious. The last thing you would ever do was join the official
Yeah.
rights organization that the school or the government had established. So is that a factor in evaluating this as well?
Yeah, I mean, and there's all these like, what is interesting, some of the things that are interesting, there's tons of spontaneous youth groups just forming now, all over the place that are not affiliated at all and are being co-opted. I mean, so it's an interesting period of time for that movement because there is a lot of spontaneous groups starting.
Sorry.
It's gone? Okay.
I was thinking about a couple of things that each of you spoke to that had to do with the process that surely was out of our collective experience that struck me. One, Harry, I was thinking that you, when you were talking about standing up at the end of the hearing in Idaho and being able to ask the judge if you could say one more thing. I was just thinking that capacity to do that grows out of so many years of changing the terms of the conversation and learning how to do those things. And similarly, Kim, I work in development as in foundations and nonprofits, and I was so struck. It was so helpful by how you were talking about this work that you're doing, helping foundations and nonprofits to be partners and doing evaluation and improving the work that they do. But not, like, I think it takes a certain kind of sensibility that grows out of all the work that we've done to be able to make those kinds of breakthroughs, which are so different than having rights or whatever. I just found that aspect of the conversation extremely helpful.
Here's what I'm wondering about. Going to the evaluation side of this, I'm wondering, as a postmodernist in this arena, and given the paradox of evaluation in the social sciences or whatever, how do you enter into your work with organizing people around that paradox? Is that something that you explicitly do? And how are you kind of winning them over to develop the organization? And in that process, can you talk about, do you hit real dead ends in terms of contradictions where the organization does not want to move forward? And just talk about that.
One more question to
Yeah.
add. What's left of evaluation? Once you go down your road, what's left of
Not
evaluation?
much.
Sorry, Harry, could you say your question?
I said, just to add to what Jen's raising, is what's left of evaluation once you start down that road?
I think the how is kind of different in almost every context, and I think, but I'm realizing that part of how, I'm kind of realizing I do this just now, is that, well, first, I think it's a real straightforward logical argument. Like, we can't do this if we don't know what it is we're looking for. So we have to have some dialogue about what it is you're doing and what are the kinds of changes that you're hoping to discover in a study of yourself, right? So that's one way. And then saying to people that, we can't do that if everybody's not at the table to have that discussion, since everybody here is working, ideally for the same kind of social change. And I think in those initial discussions, people start to discover that they're not even in the same, universe around what they mean. And we're not going to be able to look at anything if we can't agree on what we're looking at. Do you know what I mean? Including the funder, who, some development person has written a fantastic proposal that says this is what the program's doing. And what I often say to they made up a story, a particular story, and some ways that I've done it is I've been very theatrical, like I kind of give the program staff back the thing the development officer said and say, I'm going to evaluate you on that, what do you think? And then they all panic. They're not doing that. So I've been lucky enough also to leverage some position, I guess, myself with funders to say to them up front, we're not going to measure what's on that piece of paper because it's probably not at all what they're doing. So, can I have license to figure out what they're doing and help them figure out what they're doing so we can figure out, what would make sense given who this organization is. And we, that may take some time. And it makes sense, I think, to folks that would be true. So many people go with me on that journey, and we find ourselves doing something that a lot of what we're doing doesn't look. It looks like we left evaluation in the dust, right? Somewhere. I kind of think about it like the Barbara Taylor School, right? When we taught young people how to do test taking, right? That if we taught them the performance of test taker, that actually when it came time to teach them how to do the test, that was very easy, right? So in some ways, if we do this work on the upfront end of us talking about what are we doing together and what do we want to measure, it kind of, the evaluation becomes a really snappy thing at the end that we can just whip out, in some sense. And then, so we'd spend, sometimes I spend months with an organization trying to figure out where we're headed. And then, yes, I hit snags a lot. Some funders that I have want still, no matter how many research studies there are in the world that say that after-school programs have no impact on school grades, they still want me to pull those school grades out and do a pre-post measure of whether or not the school grades went up. And you can't move them. And like I said, I think I've done a pretty good job of creaming the crop because we have a lot of those conversations on the front end if that's absolutely what they want, and I try to get out of the contract and not do it with them because I don't think it's particularly helpful for them. It's a lot of money. I mean, these big studies like this could be enormous amounts of money for nothing that's useful to the organization or to find nothing. And I tell them that. But sometimes I do hit dead ends, and I realize that nobody really wants to change the way that they're doing business together, and we finish up doing an evaluation. It's meaningless.
Maybe a quick question off of this latest round. Do either or both of you think it's possible to evaluate quality? Or evaluate qualitatively is maybe what I mean. Because it seems like a lot of, at least Harry, the examples in the political arena that you were giving, they're not quantitative things. They're qualitative, substantive issues. And this question, why you can't pull out the school grades, is that it's not, you can't measure the quality of an after-school program in that way. So is it evaluatable?
Well, I was thinking, I was sitting here thinking, just before you asked that, of your initial question, isn't court about looking at evidence and reaching a scientific conclusion about, and in my mind, it has nothing to do with that. And I don't even think the court pays very much attention to that, even though there are some legal theorists who say that's what's going on. But really, I think you're right. It's much more about, well, one, it's about convincing the judge or the jury, which is most often done through a narrative, as Harriet says, that they can buy.
Right.
And it's also about finding an edge that they can't get out of, because to get out of the edge would be to undermine the very premises, like with the FEC.
Right.
you know, that if you can find that edge or wedge or whatever you want to call it, then you're looking for something that the court system has to give on if it's going to maintain the very premise of its existence, which that it's somehow fairly adjudicating, you know, your existence or your worth or your merits or your rights. But it's not. I'm not even sure that in court, the court system, there's even a pretense of it being scientific in that way, which is interesting.
Right.
You know, certainly not in terms of what actually happens.
Right.
Maybe, as I said, there's some more more social science oriented jurisprudence professors who think that
Yeah.
that's what's happening, but you know, that goes all the way, but that's not what's going on. It's much more qualitative in that way, or judgmental, or opinionated, or politics. In the best sense of the word, I think,
Yeah.
not just bad politics.
It's exactly the same in evaluation. I mean, I'm so struck by that actually, that first of all, the people who are making the decisions or reading these things have zero knowledge of how to do a scientific study.
Right.
So, I mean, zero. They don't even know how to read the report. So it's insane to think that you know, an empirical scientific model could get you closer to convincing them of something. I think that they're again looking for an edge, looking for a way to communicate the work that they do, looking for some evidence. Yeah, I totally agree.
It's weird.
There we go. This will probably be the last. Anyone else want to make a comment?
Well, this will more be a short comment, so we'll see.
Okay.
I just wanted to say thank you for coming in here and talking about evaluation and law, and then having one of the first questions from lawyers being about how you see rights and evidence and law and evaluation. From listening to you, seems to be very connected, because it's both about comparing evidence, and then we're here like 1 hour later. Well, actually, it's not at all about that.